If you ever wondered how to score an animated show from start to finish, this is the deep dive for you. In today's video, I will walk you through my step-by-step process for scoring the animated series Cave Club by Mattel. We will go from the very first idea all the way to the final orchestration, breaking it all down into 3 key steps: the gathering, the sketching, and the developing. And if you would like to see the actual episode, you can watch it on Mattel's official channel. I've put the link in the description box below. This video is for you if you're looking to develop a structured approach to composition, make your music sound more interesting and original, stay open to learning and improving, and you understand that mastering composition takes time and effort. So let's get started and break down exactly how this score came to life. And by the way, this is a longer video, so you might want to grab a cup of coffee or tea right now before you start. So you might ask, Frank, where's the interval theory stuff in there? We will get to the sketch and the development, and it's color-coded actually for you to see it better. So all of those things are based on interval theory. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. And I want to show you the early beginning. The story determines pretty much everything in the beginning, like your choice of gathered elements and materials. I picked the Lydian dominant. This was really the feel that I had when I watched the first few, seconds, 20 seconds, 30 seconds. It was very uplifting. There was this ice cream the girls had discovered, and it was really exciting. So I wanted to have this feeling in there. That is the raised 4th scale step. And in particular, I picked the Lydian dominant, not just the Lydian, because the Lydian dominant connects to various musical places like polytonality. This is a polytonal scale. That is why it works. It connects to the altered scale, by the way. That is also fantastic. It has these 4 intervals in the beginning here. And this all was a very suitable starting point for me. So that is why I picked it. And to give you a quick idea of how this sounds, that is the scale. And from there, I extracted already some ideas. Now, first, I picked those 4s in here that happen pretty early on in the scale. So that is this guy, that guy. And you hear this character quite often also in romantic comedy. You can alternate between this one triad and then you go up by 2 chromatic steps. And this always works wonderfully in romantic comedy as well. It turned out it also works in animation. So once you have these 2 guys, you can do some position changes. For those who don't know exactly what position changes are, it's the complementary interval. You pick the lowest guy, put it up an octave. Right, so that is why these guys here show up as an 8. So the 4 and the 8, they complement each other to 12. That's the octave. So up to this point, I think all pretty easy to understand. One next thing that I did is, so I picked my C major triad and then simply put it through the RC4, the root cycle 4, because I started with 4. So I just used the 4 as an expansion of the following techniques to go into more connected material. So that is my root cycle 4, using proper voice leading, by the way. You can do different things like substitute voice leading on top. You can go parallel. That is all fine. I just want to use the same triad over each respective root tone. So the C going to the E, to the A flat, back to the C, all major triads. And this is what it sounds like. So that already brings you out of a key, because you play the G note, then you have a G sharp out of a sudden, you have the E and an E flat all in one progression. And it's not that easy anymore to determine the key or the overall scale. And that is what I wanted to play with. But this all can connect back seamlessly to our starting point from above. and that is the scale. So I use this thing here with the Lydian dominant. Then I use this guy also with the Lydian dominant, right? And I continue this to go into the A flat right there. So I have now an all-encompassing idea that started this whole conversation, this musical conversation, which was the Lydian dominant scale. So that all is a completed idea for harmony, for background movement, for filling material almost. Since in those scores, it is important to have two things: strong themes that you can rely on, that you can reuse in almost every place, and you want to have filling materials, because that helps you bridge from A to B in the story. So let's grab some other ideas then. And this is not really connected to my previous ones, although it still connects to the scale. Now, the Lydian dominant has one property, which is a wonderful thing. It connects to the Poly 6 connection. And that is already a little hint that you can use this scale in polytonality. And let me quickly show you the two tonal centers. The first one is created between those two guys. That is the C root tone. The next one is this guy. If I wrote this enharmonically, now you can see it. It's the F sharp, or I can write it enharmonically this way. Now it's the G flat. And this also connects to the Poly 6. Now we have as an option the Poly 2 also available. This is pretty much what I did here. That's the Poly 2. If you look at the two root tones, they are in the distance of a 2 interval. Now down there, everything is in the distance of a 6 interval. And what always works best in polytonality is a dominant chord on top of these root tones. So that is why I picked my dominant 7th chord. Guess what these guys are? They are all scale tones. Also with the next guy, this one is also the same notes, but now the perspective changed. The moment we go to the A flat down there, let's quickly see what is happening. So now, enharmonically written, we have scale tone -7, that's the G flat. And I'm actually relating everything to the A flat now. Okay, so we have scale tone -7, scale tone 3, that is the C, and guess what that D note is? It's 4+ again. So this all can be based on the Lydian dominant on an A flat as well. This is exactly the opposite of things. So I started with the A flat dominant 7th, and then I simply switched the root tone. And here, this is pretty much the same structure as this guy, but now based on the D root tone, which means we have scale tone -7, we have scale tone 3 written enharmonically right there, and this guy is scale tone 4+ written enharmonically. So again, it's the Lydian dominant. The jazz guys also would refer to this as the tritone substitution in the bass, because this pretty much outlines the tritone. That's the 6 interval. That is not the way how I see it, because the tritone substitution already implies a tonic. So you have to have the key and the scale and everything determined. With the Poly 6, you just have to have a dominant structure on top, no matter what your root tone is that you want to move into later, or your tonic that you want to resolve into. It doesn't matter. There are various choices we can resolve these guys. But it all sounds very consistent when we switch to the respective other root tone down there. So this is what it sounds like. And that is the opposite. And the reason why that works is the overtone series. So these guys here become overtones to the respective root tones that we are using down there. They don't create any harsh dissonance against the root, and the overtones coming from these lower guys. Now, I mentioned that you want to have two things for scoring a lot of animation. You want to have filling material, and we are pretty much prepared for this part already. What we are still missing is a theme. So I wrote down a few theme ideas, I remember, but this is the one that I picked. So I don't want to bother you with my ideas that didn't make it into the score. And I just want to show you the one that I actually used. So that is this guy. Now we can go very deep with just this theme and determine the horizontal formula real quick. And I could have done this beforehand, but let's do it now. That is a 4. So we start from this guy, go up by 4, go up by 3. That is our major triad. And then we go down by 1, right? So that is our horizontal formula to this guy. And we can extract a ton of ideas just from this, which now brings me to the sketch. Let me ask you, do you know why I have this empty bar in front of everything right there? And I have a feeling that most of you know why that is. In case you don't know, this is really the 2-pop placeholder. And a 2-pop, that is 2 seconds in front of your first frame where you're supposed to start the music. That is why I picked 120 BPM. This results in exactly 2 seconds. So I want to be synchronized with this 2-pop so that the editor later understands where I want to have the beginning of this cue. Otherwise, they move things around by ear and they might be a few frames off, and then out of a sudden, it doesn't match the visuals anymore. So then I picked this tempo, mainly following the pace of the visuals. So I look at the visuals and I have my tempo. Usually I just tap on the table. It's pretty old school, I know, but it works. And I try to figure out the rhythm of how they talk, the rhythm of the scene changes, like how often they happen. I would recommend that you don't change the tempo and the time signature at the same time. I would pick a tempo that fits over a long branch of the story, and you will have changes in the tempo, I guarantee. But this is how I picked my tempo right there. And you will see that I either change my tempo or the time signature. I believe down there at some point, yes, here I have a slight change. You probably won't recognize this clearly, that there is a change, but this was a better tempo to match the visuals. But let's get into some of the interval theory action in here. So you might have already seen that these color codings here, I try to be as specific as possible. So this guy is my little theme. This guy now becomes a little seed that you can water and that you can let grow in the episode. But you have to present it early on. Otherwise, the audience can't know that this is your theme. And you don't have to present it in a bold way or big way. You can make it subtle, but have it in the beginning somewhere. And I actually wanted to have a little transition into this whole scene. I didn't want to start with the theme because this girl in the beginning is running towards the other girl, right? And then they start talking. I think everybody would just watch her and the action because this moves very quickly. And whatever has a lot of kinetic energy attracts attention. So if I would have provided the theme next to her running around the scene, nobody would have recognized the musical theme. So I waited until she stopped running. That is why I'm having this trill in the beginning. And I could have picked other notes in here. I wanted to highlight the Lydian sound already, although I'm not even playing the root tone, so nobody can know that this is 4+, scale tone 4+. But the moment we go to the root tone here, then it reveals itself as the 3rd and the 4+ of the scale. And now this is already the moment where I used some of my gathered material. So next to this theme, I just used my RC4 in the bass to connect everything a little bit. So I have the C root tone here, and I base all my other tones on top on the scale, the Lydian dominant. Then I move into the E with a fluent line in the bass, which is this guy. Right? And when I get to the E right there, I make this E into my new root tone. That is why these guys will now turn into scale tones to that root tone, still using the Lydian dominant. Then from there, and I want to stick to my root tones real quick, I actually move into the A flat, which is the next one. But I'm not playing the A flat in the lower register because this would have been very obvious. And I don't want to be obvious. I want to be interesting with the music. So my first way was to think in different registers. That's a good choice. So I went to this upper register and simply wrote a run. And I want you to look at the color-coded line only, because this follows the scale tones. So we have scale tone 1, then we have 2, 3, and 4 plus shown in brown. Then from there, remember my poly 6 connection? Let's go into this poly 6 connection. Now the D becomes my root tone, and I play the same Lydian dominant scale again, starting from the D note. I misclicked, and this is the G sharp scale tone 4 plus. And that is already a nice sound that can live in the world that we start to create. This all is based on the same notes. But you can see clearly out of a sudden, if you just looked at the notes without any explanation, there are a ton of accidentals, and it's not really clear why we have an F sharp, an F flat out of a sudden. Simultaneously to the F sharp, we have a G flat, which doesn't make any sense. But now that you know the gathered elements that I'm just placing on the canvas, it becomes clearer. So I even thought, since I like the 4 interval, let's make this scale tone line a bit thicker and even more interesting. So what I like to do in that case is I pick a locked interval. I picked the 4 because I based the RC on my 4 interval. I will explain these guys in green in a second. And it all follows a very similar concept. So I want to stay consistent with that musical description of the sonic world. That is why I just wrote a locked interval below the color-coded notes, and that is what it sounds like. It doesn't sound like this all comes from the same scale, I know. But then when I get to the last guy here, I wanted to have this emphasis also in the lower register. So the question became, how can I move into something that supports the end of the run and still has something that fluently leads into those notes? So that is why I wrote this guy first, and then these guys in red after the fact. And they are all chromatic tones. So I have the F going into the F sharp. I have the A going into the B flat. I have the natural B going into the C note. But I wrote it from right to left. I wrote it in reverse. So that is a very good concept if you don't know where to start, but you know exactly this is where I want to end. It sounds like expansion because it is. I'm loving it. And that is pretty much how I got to these guys down there. Now let me cover what happens in green. This also follows our 4s and 8s. So I picked this guy, which is the 4, B flat and D. From there, I go to a position change. So that is an 8. Here is another 8, and then I go to my 4 again. And I picked these tones. We can actually see how they connect to the E root tone. The top guy is scale tone -7 because we are still on this scale right here. So that is -7. This guy is the root. This one is scale tone 4 plus. This guy is scale tone 3. So that is what I wrote first. And then I used my 4 or 8 downwards to make it a bit more interesting and have it a bit more as a thicker line, so to speak. And I also want to play you this thing real quick. So that is exactly what I meant by filling material. This is just stuff that you won't remember, I understand, but it's important to have something that leads you from A to B. So that is why I'm using these 4s and 8s in there. So let's quickly come back to some of our roots. And that happens right there. So that line is, again, the root cycle 4. We have the C going up to the E, going up to the A flat, although I'm using an octave position. I wrote this guy after the fact, my leading tone, to create a better line. So if I would not have done this, let me show you that. It would have sounded like this. Not very connected. Now let's hear it with the leading tone. Sounds way better. And guess what is happening on top? A 4 going to a 4 in parallel. And it won't surprise you because you know the sound already by now. We are 11 seconds into this thing and all what I'm presenting to you is the 4 interval. That is really the fun part as the composer, because to me, the story is pretty clear up to that point, and it probably sounds consistent to the audience, although it doesn't follow a specific key. And let me just show you this in context up to this point. Please excuse this sloppy playback. This comes from my bad audio driver. Sometimes it sounds like a 3-year-old would play the sketch, and I apologize for that. I don't know any better way right now to solve this. So from here, actually, I think that's the moment where she realized, okay, this tastes delicious. Now she tasted the ice cream. So that is the moment, I think, here where she got this thing into her mouth. And then this needs a little bit of a break and a different flavor. And I will do this in the orchestration. However, all of those elements that we are looking at, they are still following the same concepts. We have our root cycle 4, so that's the C, E, A flat. Then this guy here, that is a little bit different, I understand, but it's a 4 interval still, the D going to the F sharp. Now I want to explain what is happening up there, because there are 2 ways how you can look at this. The most obvious way would be to determine that interval, the vertical one, which is a 10, and this goes to the 8, and it goes back to the 10, to the 8, back to the 10, and then into open harmony, that's a 14, which is a 10 in open harmony. But still, there is another way of looking at stuff. What I had in mind is actually this. So I have the C and the A flat as a pair, and then I have the B flat and the D as a pair. And if you look at the distances between those guys, that's an 8. That's an 8. And that is what I did before, which means I wrote it so it all went in parallel, up and down. That was my first idea. Let's move the 8 in a parallel way. It's not very interesting though. So let's make this a little bit more interesting after the fact. And I did it via displacing those tones, and it happened this way. Now we have a 10 moving to the 8, but it was not my base of thinking actually. So that is just a little scale tone run with a leading tone, a chromatic leading tone into my root tone. And again, I wrote this thing also after the fact. So I don't worry about any run the moment I sketch it. I see runs as a nice way to connect my points that I want to highlight after the fact. And then I put these things in reverse, so that I can smear the energy a bit more into other places so that it sounds more connected. But when I write these sketches, definitely I'm not writing all of those details linearly as I move through it. Now, when we get to this guy here, this was a filling moment again. And I realized this reminds me of something. Yes, I did this in the beginning. So guess what? Let's come back to our theme. So this element in the beginning has now grown to a little plant that I can reuse after 18 seconds. And I want to still change it a little bit. And I put a variation of my motif into the lower register. And I think that is on the cellos later. So it happens right there. I play it on the cellos, then I repeat it. So let me play everything until we reach that point down there. So let's start from here. And this guy is exactly what we looked at in the Poly 6 relation gathering. So that is pretty much how I connect this structure here, which now becomes actually that guy. That would be based on the D root tone. That is really an interesting change in the perspective, although you're not changing anything in the notes. But the listener now gets a different light on the same scale tones. That makes it so interesting with polytonality. And I do pretty much the same thing up here. Also realized that I placed this guy on top of everything. This actually would have happened down here because it's part of harmony, but it would have clashed with my string motif. And I wanted to have more transparency. For that reason, I moved it up by 1 octave and opened that space so that now this line can jump in that space and everybody will hear it. Now, when I got to this guy here, I love these transitions via ones. And I didn't know that it would lead me necessarily to the F root tone. I just looked at my structure and then I realized, okay, how can I move things around chromatically so that I come out of this whole thing on a major triad? And in here, it led me to the F. So I moved this thing down. I moved this A flat to the natural A. This is definitely not a chromatic movement here, the D going to the F. But here we have something, the A flat. This actually would go to the C note. That's also not chromatically, but you will actually get the connection because you get to hear the A as well, although it comes from a different voice. But I will put all of these things into the strings later. And that is a little workaround, by the way. If you don't have time to write it out properly, put it all into the same instrument family, either the strings, the woodwinds, or the brass. Nobody's going to recognize it. So I would rather sketch down the idea quickly, move on, and don't get stuck. So that is why I think it's at least important to mention. Now I got into this guy, and here comes another trick. The moment you have a held chord, that's a fantastic moment where you can change the tempo. Nobody's going to recognize it because it is hiding under this sustained chord. And if you did a live recording, this is also very beneficial because here you are still on the old tempo, 135 or whatever it was, 36. And then you have this whole bar for the conductor to count so that everybody knows exactly what tempo they start on when they actually get to play in the following bar. So you want to have a little bit of time to prepare all of these things. And you will run into problems in the performance if you don't do it. It takes a second or two before everybody plays together again. And with those rest points almost, this is a great workaround. So let me quickly just replay this to you up to that moment down there. The actual thing happens right there. This is all the introduction. And I needed to bridge over these exact number of seconds. That is why I have this 2/4 bar in here. I had to make a time signature change. I could have gone to a 6/4 in total, but this made more sense to me. That is just the introduction into this theme down there. And it is almost a new theme that I believe we pick up in various places in the filling materials later in the score. But that is just one big line. And you hear the separation now between harmony and melody very clearly. Here you're seeing I'm playing 3 chromatics in a row. And this is something that I would usually not do because we don't have any scale in our Western diatonic system that has these three chromatics except the chromatic scale. And I wanted to have this sound in there. So I didn't bother. This was really something that I whistled beforehand and it came very natural to me. So this is not a big theoretical concept, like that is how it works. But let me first show you what the melody sounds like, and then we will look into harmony. So that is the whole line. I will split it later into two instrument parts so that they create a call and response type of an idea. Down there in harmony, this is what that is. Sounds like a cadence to me, right? So we end on the C, so we play the F, the D flat, and that is really the tritone substitution now. And it all resolves into our C root tone right there. And it's interesting because this connects strongly to jazz. So let me just play this once again. So then from here, again, the preparation also for this little variation of the theme that I bring in. And by the way, I did it always when the story was about the ice cream. Again, when we look at this whole thing, then you will realize every time they either talk about the ice cream or it comes into the visuals, you will hear this theme shown in blue. And this also is a subtle push almost for the audience that makes them feel something like, got this point already. Now the theme is there again. Why is that? Ice cream, okay. And they connect the dots emotionally. They will. But we composers, we have to think about that. Otherwise, it's not logical. And the logical explanation actually leads to the emotional storytelling, but they are connected. Now again, remember the Poly 6 connection? Wonderful structure. In this case, all based on the F and the B triad, both of them being major. Love those little things. And the way you do it is you play the F major and the B major, and then you just put the tones out that you don't want to hear. And I ended up with those guys here in that register. And I realized that I have to move a bit quicker. If you went through some of the lessons already, then you are familiar with the equivalence and also that the 3 + 3 is not stable and it can resolve in various ways. Now, the way I like personally, as you know by now, is the transition via once. And in this case, I resolve it into an E flat root tone without any specific reason behind it, I think. It was an accident, let's call it, resulting out of this 3 + 3 structure. Now, I did write this line here after the fact to make the transition a bit more stronger, especially this guy. That is the dominant to this guy. It sets up the new tonal center. And once we get here, we will listen to all this in a second. I wanted to have a motor, first and foremost, that pushes the energy forward. That is why you're seeing this repeated staccato G note. And these guys just connect to this idea that we had, all based on our Lydian dominant scale. Having the E flat in the bass, this outlines the E flat major triad. And this one hints on the second triad that would have happened on the F root tone, consisting of scale tone 4+ and 6. And this is what I wanted to hear. It's a 3 interval, it's not a 4, but it completes the triad. That is why I picked it. And you will hear this constellation a few more times. Right there, for example, right here, this guy even. So let me then show you what this sounds like. And I think we will start from here. Yeah, and then it transitions with this dominant 7th chord because I wrote the guitar part all based on the A root tone, because it's easy to play on the open string. So that is why I wanted to set up the A tonal center. And the E dominant 7th chord here simply helps me transition into the A. That is all what this guy is. But I find it interesting because this little blues lick here, and blues lick because we have scale tone -3 and 3 in there, this chromatic alteration. This is again just filling material. But once you have something, and if you look at the shape of this guy, you can just repeat the shape in other places. And that is how I think in terms of filling material. Let's have the same elements reappear in different places. And this way it will sound connected to the audience. So let me then transition quickly to the orchestration. We will also listen to Note Performer, although the version that made it into the final video was based on samples, not Note Performer. I did it in Cubase actually and recreated the score after the fact. So that is why the sounds are different in this playback here, but still it is exactly what is going on in the original recording. So let me first talk you through some of those parts, and we will listen to the instrument section. Since it all starts on the strings, let's start here. And while this fades out, guess what is happening right there in the woodwinds? The oboe and the clarinet in particular. Yeah, that is this little run right there, all based on the Poly 6 connection. This guy also showed up in the sketch, and here I have some choices. I picked the horns because the horns are pretty close to the woodwind section anyway. They can play very softly, they can play very loud, and it just is a good blend with those woodwind instruments. So the trombones probably would have had too much power in there. Glockenspiel, marimba, celeste, they are all not suitable for this purpose. So this is just to give a bit more power to the moment when she guts the ice cream into her face. That happens on this strong moment here. So let me then play you this whole thing in total. Yeah. From here, we come back to our root tones, the root cycle 4. So that is here happening on the clarinet, and we bring in the 4 interval on the other guys. Let's listen to this. Again, our filling material down there. Here you can see it. That is really how I thought about the vertical 10s going to the 8s. It's actually all based on 8s. And also, if you went through the course, then you understand how these intervals connect to each other. And by displacing stuff, that is actually a brilliant technique to hide the real character. Pretty much like you can do by picking, let's say, the Lydian dominant and never play scale tone 4+ until the very end. Nobody will know that you picked the Lydian scale because they are not hearing the characteristic moment of the scale. And that is also what I did here. I created the 10, but it's all connected to the 8, actually. Now, these guys that you occasionally start seeing on the Glockenspiel, celesta, marimba, these are all for decoration, and I brought them in later for either doubling or for creating an effect so that it becomes a bit more mysterious. But let me play it from here. This rest point, remember the tempo change. I bet you didn't recognize it. That is the idea. That is solving the puzzle of scoring a scene and still have some music that sounds fluent and not just pieced together. You want to avoid ripping the audience out of the story because they recognize how poorly the music is written in terms of the natural flow. So that is a nice moment, by the way. I can show this in solo real quick. Love it. And this is something that I've stolen from Alan Silvestri and Back to the Future. He jumps on these Poly 6 chords all the time, and it sounds fantastic. If you want to steal it as well, I'm pretty sure he doesn't mind. This helps bridge over this moment. So let me replay this to you, and you will realize now the celeste helps with the transition into the next bar. And I need this break right there and also right here. Because here I needed to let the string players change from arco to pizzicato. Here this change is important for the cellos. The double basses have enough time. And that is also something that you want to remember. If you do live sessions, give the players enough time to change for the articulations. This includes stuff like mutes for the brass, the pizzicato technique, because they have to get rid of the bow. And the shorter this transition time period is, the more noise they will make. And that is something that you don't want to hear in the recording later. So you want to give them a little bit of time to make the adjustment, and then they can be more careful. But let's quickly focus on how this celesta helps with the transition. Now, here was the change in color, first in staccato, and I highlighted it even more by using the marimba. A lot of attack, and together it actually highlights the staccato playing technique. So then this line stops here, but the response happens on the clarinet. So the line just continues, but the color changes. And with that in mind, let's re-listen to that section, and I want to actually make the clarinet visible. You can absolutely hear that this chord, it is kind of stable, but it has this magical feeling to it. This comes from scale tone 4+ in there, the combination of this F and B root tone. And I really like this. The 4+ in there, it always brightens simple major triads. Great. Almost reminds me of Lord of the Rings. So then here we come back to our motif, at least the variation of it. So I want to show you this real quick. I really like how this all resolves, and now it turns on this motor. This is just so satisfying because we have so many rest points before, and that's the first moment in the score where actually things move forward on its own. That's a good moment. And actually in the story, you realize that is the moment where one of the gals start explaining what happened. So it is this explanatory part, and I wanted to have this motor in the background to make it a bit more comedic. So again, the story determines the elements. I never used a motor before. So guess what? It might be a good choice. It might be interesting while repeating other elements that we heard before. And in this case, this one outlines the scale, because I did not want to change the scale at all. It's all based on the same thing. This is our red line throughout the whole cue. But in other places, like here, this is just a nice contrasting moment to what came before. And then it pretty much fades out. Now, for those guys who want to dive deeper, we have the full academy with those concepts and ideas and techniques ready for you to explore all of that. I just want to point out quickly that the diatonic system and interval theory actually move hand in hand. And that is how you can get the most out of it. The diatonic system will always have the biggest audience, find a proper balance between exotic writing and the diatonic mainstream stuff. And with interval theory, we provide, I think, a wonderful balance in between. If you want to check out the Academy, I invite you to try your 7-day trial and see what is all available, how it works. It is really a treasure trove of techniques and musical ideas that lead to more interesting and unique music. And I can't wait to see you in either one of our future introduction events or maybe inside the Academy. I would love to welcome you there as well. So this was Frank. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Bye.